The people who overlook the quietest neighbor often discover too late that kindness leaves the deepest mark. Grace Carter had never expected anyone on Willow Creek Lane to notice her. She certainly never imagined that the famous actor living next door would one day remember the smile he never returned. The peaceful neighborhood rested beneath tall maple trees, where children rode bicycles along clean sidewalks and neighbors greeted one another every morning with friendly waves. At the end of the street stood an elegant modern home surrounded by carefully trimmed hedges and security gates. It belonged to Daniel Brooks, one of America's most recognizable movie stars. Every week fans gathered outside hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Photographers occasionally waited across the street, and delivery trucks arrived almost daily carrying wardrobe boxes, film equipment, and gifts from admirers around the country. Only a few houses away stood a much smaller white cottage with blue shutters and a flower garden that seemed to bloom in every season. That modest home had recently become the new residence of 25-year-old Grace Carter. She wore a simple light blue dress while carrying neatly packed moving boxes through her front door, stopping occasionally to thank the moving company employees with sincere appreciation. Her warm smile came naturally, and her gentle eyes reflected the quiet confidence of someone who measured success by kindness instead of recognition. Most neighbors barely noticed her arrival because everyone's attention remained fixed on the celebrity living nearby. Late that afternoon, Grace stepped outside to water the colorful flowers lining her small front porch. Just as she finished, a black luxury vehicle slowly entered the neighboring driveway. Daniel stepped out wearing casual clothes, sunglasses, and a baseball cap, hoping to avoid attracting attention after returning from another film project. Grace recognized him immediately, not because she followed celebrity news, but because his face appeared on movie posters throughout the city. She offered a polite smile and gently waved. "Good afternoon," she said warmly. Daniel glanced briefly in her direction before turning toward his front door without answering. He was exhausted after weeks of travel, distracted by work, and accustomed to avoiding conversations with strangers who often wanted photographs or favors. To him, Grace was simply another unfamiliar face. To Grace, it was only an awkward first meeting. She quietly lowered her hand, smiled to herself, and continued watering the flowers as though nothing unusual had happened. Across the street, two longtime neighbors watched the brief exchange from their front porch. One quietly whispered that Daniel probably had more important things to think about than greeting new residents. The other simply shrugged and agreed. Grace heard neither comment. She carefully placed the watering can beside the porch steps and noticed an elderly woman struggling to carry several grocery bags from her car. Without hesitation, Grace crossed the street, introduced herself, and offered to help carry the groceries inside. The older woman accepted with grateful appreciation, surprised that someone she had never met would volunteer so quickly. Daniel happened to glance through his living room window while setting down his luggage. He saw the young woman helping the elderly neighbor, paused for only a moment, and then walked away without another thought. To him, it was an ordinary act performed by an ordinary person. Yet somewhere beyond the quiet routine of that peaceful neighborhood, life had already begun preparing a lesson neither fame nor success could ever teach as deeply as one simple act of genuine compassion. The following morning, the neighborhood awakened beneath clear blue skies and the comforting sounds of birds singing from the maple trees that lined Willow Creek Lane. Fresh sunlight reflected across neatly trimmed lawns while neighbors walked their dogs, collected newspapers, and greeted one another before beginning another ordinary day. Grace Carter followed the same quiet routine she had practiced for years. She watered the flowers surrounding her small front porch, checked on the elderly woman she had helped the previous afternoon, and carried a basket of freshly baked muffins to another neighbor. Recovering from recent surgery, she expected nothing in return. Helping people simply felt as natural to her as breathing. A few houses away, Daniel Brooks prepared for another demanding schedule. His assistant arrived early with filming updates, interview requests, and revised travel plans for an upcoming production. A luxury vehicle waited in the driveway while security personnel quietly monitored the growing number of fans gathering beyond the front gate. Cameras occasionally flashed whenever Daniel stepped outside, and every movement seemed to attract attention. Even within his own neighborhood, privacy had become something he rarely experienced. As he entered the waiting vehicle, Grace happened to be walking home after delivering breakfast to the recovering neighbor. She noticed Daniel preparing to leave and offered another warm smile accompanied by a gentle wave. Daniel briefly acknowledged her presence with a polite nod before climbing into the vehicle, his thoughts already occupied by scripts, production meetings, and endless obligations. It was not intentional unkindness. He had simply become so accustomed to living inside a carefully managed routine that ordinary human moments often passed unnoticed. Throughout the following week, the difference between their lives became increasingly visible. Grace quietly learned the names of nearly everyone living on the street. She helped children retrieve balls that rolled into gardens, returned misplaced mail to the correct homes, and volunteered to walk an older neighbor's dog while he attended a medical appointment. She spent evenings reading community newsletters and looking for opportunities to support local charity events. Meanwhile, Daniel's home remained surrounded by constant activity. Delivery trucks arrived with costumes and equipment, entertainment reporters occasionally waited nearby, and visitors came and went through the secured entrance. Although many people admired his accomplishments, very few truly knew him beyond the public image that followed him everywhere. One afternoon, Grace noticed a delivery driver struggling to unload several heavy packages near Daniel's front entrance while speaking politely into a headset about an already delayed schedule. Without hesitation, she crossed the street and offered assistance, carefully carrying several boxes beneath the covered entryway before thanking the driver for his hard work. The grateful driver smiled with obvious relief, explaining that small acts of kindness often made difficult days much easier. At that exact moment, Daniel opened the front door after finishing an online interview. He briefly observed Grace setting down the final package before quietly thanking the driver and walking away toward her own home. Daniel assumed she was simply being courteous, nodded politely, and closed the door without another thought. He never realized that no cameras had captured the moment, no audience would ever applaud it, and Grace had expected absolutely nothing for her effort. Yet those unnoticed moments were slowly shaping a story far greater than either of them could imagine. Sometimes the smallest acts leave no immediate impression at all, only to become the very memories people treasure when life unexpectedly asks them what truly matters. Days turned into weeks, and Willow Creek Lane settled into its familiar rhythm, where every house seemed to hold a different story. Grace Carter continued living exactly as she always had, never seeking attention and never expecting recognition from anyone around her. Each morning, she walked through the neighborhood carrying a reusable canvas bag filled with books for the small community reading program at the local library before stopping to check on several elderly residents who appreciated her quiet company more than they ever expressed with words. Children smiled whenever they saw her because she always remembered their names and listened patiently to their stories about school, baseball games, and family pets. She believed every person deserved to feel noticed, even during the busiest days. Daniel Brooks lived only a few houses away, yet his life seemed to belong to an entirely different world. Television interviews, production meetings, promotional events, and endless travel filled nearly every hour of his schedule. Luxury vehicles arrived before sunrise and often returned long after dark. Fans occasionally waited outside the security gate hoping for a brief wave or autograph, while reporters searched constantly for another headline involving the famous actor. Although Daniel remained polite whenever professional obligations required public appearances, genuine moments of peace had become increasingly rare. One quiet Saturday afternoon, Grace noticed an older delivery driver struggling to push a heavily loaded hand cart up the slight incline leading toward Daniel's front entrance. The summer heat had become unusually intense, and the man paused several times to catch his breath before continuing. Without hesitation, Grace walked across the street and smiled warmly. She gently asked whether she could help move a few of the lighter packages so the driver could finish more comfortably. The grateful man accepted immediately, explaining that he had worked the same route for nearly 20 years and that simple acts of kindness had become increasingly uncommon. Grace carried several boxes with careful attention, making certain everything remained organized before thanking him for the work he performed every day. She quietly wished him a safe afternoon and turned to leave. At that exact moment, Daniel opened his front door after completing a lengthy virtual interview. He briefly observed Grace placing the final package beside the entrance before the delivery driver expressed heartfelt appreciation. Daniel offered a courteous nod, assuming she had simply been helping for a few moments, and returned inside to prepare for another meeting. He never asked her name, never realized she had interrupted her own plans to assist someone she had never met, and never imagined that no camera had captured the scene. Grace continued walking home with the same peaceful expression she wore every day, believing kindness mattered most when nobody was watching. Across the street, an elderly neighbor witnessed the entire exchange from her porch swing and quietly smiled to herself. She had lived long enough to understand that character revealed itself through ordinary moments rather than extraordinary speeches. As evening sunlight settled gently across the quiet neighborhood, Daniel's world continued revolving around schedules, appearances, and expectations, while Grace's world remained centered on compassion expressed through small unnoticed choices. Neither of them realized that life was slowly weaving those quiet moments together into a lesson that would soon transform not only the way they saw each other, but also the meaning of success, respect, and what truly leaves a lasting impression on another human heart. One warm autumn afternoon, the peaceful rhythm of Willow Creek Lane changed in a way no one expected. The neighborhood gathered for its annual community appreciation picnic in the small park at the end of the street, where children played beneath colorful maple trees, local musicians performed familiar songs, and families shared homemade food across long wooden tables decorated with fresh flowers. Grace Carter arrived early carrying several baskets filled with baked goods she had prepared the night before for the community fundraiser. She quietly helped volunteers arrange chairs, greeted every neighbor with her usual warmth, and made certain the elderly residents had comfortable places to sit beneath the shade. Daniel Brooks arrived much later after finishing a television interview in the city. As always, his appearance immediately attracted attention. Neighbors politely welcomed him while several visitors asked for photographs and autographs. Daniel smiled graciously and fulfilled every request, although the constant attention left him visibly exhausted. Throughout the afternoon, he remained surrounded by conversations, cameras, and admiration, while Grace continued helping behind the scenes where very few people noticed her efforts. As the event slowly came to life, a young volunteer accidentally knocked over a large container holding bottled water intended for everyone attending the picnic. Dozens of bottles rolled across the walking path while the embarrassed teenager froze in place, overwhelmed by the unexpected mistake. Many guests watched for a moment before returning to their conversations, assuming someone else would handle the situation. Grace immediately walked over, knelt beside the scattered bottles, and calmly began gathering them with an encouraging smile. She gently told the volunteer that accidents happen to everyone and that there was nothing to be ashamed of. Hearing those reassuring words, several nearby children joined Grace without being asked, happily collecting the remaining bottles and placing them back into the container. Within only a few minutes, the problem had completely disappeared, replaced by laughter and renewed confidence. Daniel happened to witness the entire scene from a nearby table where he had been speaking with community organizers. He noticed something he had overlooked many times before. Grace never gave instructions loudly, never searched for recognition, and never waited for applause. People simply felt comfortable following her quiet example because her kindness made them want to become kinder themselves. Before Daniel could reflect any further, an elderly neighbor sitting alone beneath one of the trees suddenly appeared, slightly unsteady after standing too quickly. Grace noticed the movement immediately, walked over with calm composure, offered her arm for support, and helped the woman return comfortably to her chair before bringing her a bottle of water and asking another volunteer to remain nearby. Everything happened naturally, gently, and without unnecessary attention. Daniel watched the scene with growing curiosity. He realized that Grace had spent the entire afternoon solving small problems before anyone else even recognized they existed. None of her actions were dramatic enough to become headlines, yet each one quietly made life easier for someone else. For the first time since she had moved into the neighborhood, Daniel found himself wondering who she truly was beyond the simple light blue dress, the gentle smile, and the quiet greetings he had so often overlooked. Somewhere deep inside, a feeling he had not experienced in years slowly emerged. It was not admiration for fame or accomplishment. It was genuine respect born from witnessing quiet character revealed through ordinary moments, and he sensed that this unexpected realization was only the beginning of a lesson that would soon change both of their lives forever. The afternoon picnic continued beneath clear autumn skies, yet something inside Daniel Brooks had quietly begun to change. For years he had believed that influence came from public recognition, successful films, and the ability to inspire millions through a screen. As he watched Grace Carter move effortlessly from one quiet act of kindness to another, he realized she possessed a different kind of influence, one that required no audience and left no room for applause. Children naturally gathered around her because she listened instead of speaking over them. Elderly neighbors smiled whenever she approached because they trusted her gentle presence. Volunteers seemed more confident simply because Grace encouraged them without making them feel inadequate. None of those moments would ever appear in entertainment magazines, but together they carried a quiet power Daniel had almost forgotten existed. As the afternoon drew toward its conclusion, community organizers announced a small raffle benefiting the Neighborhood Assistance Fund. Guests gradually gathered near the main pavilion while local musicians played soft acoustic melodies in the background. Daniel agreed to help present several donated prizes, drawing warm applause from the crowd. Before the ceremony could begin, one of the organizers quietly realized that the envelope containing the raffle tickets had accidentally been left inside the community center across the park. Several volunteers hesitated, unsure who should leave the busy event to retrieve it before the program fell behind schedule. Without drawing attention to herself, Grace simply smiled and said she would be happy to bring it back. She walked calmly across the shaded pathway, collected the envelope, and returned only a few minutes later, handing it to the organizer before quietly stepping back into the crowd. Most people barely noticed what had happened because the program continued without interruption. Daniel, however, had watched the entire sequence unfold. He realized that Grace had once again solved a problem before anyone else even recognized there was one, asking for nothing and expecting absolutely nothing in return. After the raffle concluded, Daniel found himself walking toward Grace for the first genuine conversation they had ever shared. He thanked her for helping make the event run so smoothly and admitted that he had noticed how many people relied on her quiet generosity. Grace smiled with the same warmth she had shown since moving into the neighborhood. Communities become stronger when everyone does small things for each other, she answered softly. Most people are already kind. Sometimes they only need someone willing to take the first step. Her simple words lingered in Daniel's thoughts far longer than he expected. They contained no criticism, no reminder of the greetings he had ignored, and no hint that she expected an apology. Instead, she offered him the same kindness she offered everyone else. As the sun slowly lowered beyond the maple trees, neighbors began folding chairs and cleaning the park together. Daniel quietly joined several volunteers gathering empty tables instead of leaving early as he usually did after public appearances. Grace noticed him helping, but said nothing, allowing his actions to speak for themselves. The elderly woman Grace had first assisted on moving day watched the scene with a gentle smile and whispered to another neighbor, "Sometimes one quiet heart teaches louder lessons than 1,000 speeches." Daniel looked across the park and saw Grace laughing with children while carrying another box of supplies toward the community center. For the first time since she had become his neighbor, he no longer saw an ordinary young woman living next door. He saw someone whose quiet example had begun changing the way he measured success, respect, and the true meaning of leaving a lasting mark on another person's life. The days following the neighborhood picnic passed quietly, but Daniel Brooks found himself thinking about Grace Carter far more often than he expected. Between movie sets, interviews, and long flights across the country, her simple words returned to him with surprising clarity. Most people are already kind. Sometimes they only need someone willing to take the first step. The sentence stayed with him because it described something he had forgotten during years of living beneath constant attention. Fame had surrounded him with admiration, yet it had also placed invisible distance between him and ordinary moments that once brought genuine happiness. One peaceful Saturday morning, Daniel noticed Grace loading several reusable boxes into the trunk of her small car. Curious, he walked across the street for the first time since she had moved into the neighborhood. "Good morning," he said with a sincere smile. Grace looked pleasantly surprised before returning the greeting with the same warmth she had always offered. Daniel asked whether she was preparing for another community event. Grace explained that every weekend she volunteered at a neighborhood resource center where families could receive donated groceries, books, school supplies, and household necessities. She invited him to visit if his schedule ever allowed, adding that extra helping hands were always welcome. Daniel accepted almost immediately, surprising even himself. Later that morning, they arrived together at the community center, where volunteers greeted Grace by name and welcomed Daniel politely without making him the center of attention. For the first time in many years, Daniel spent several uninterrupted hours organizing food boxes, carrying donations, arranging bookshelves, and speaking with local families without cameras following his every movement. Grace quietly introduced him to longtime volunteers, but never mentioned his career unless someone else recognized him. She treated him exactly as she treated everyone else, as another neighbor willing to help. During a short break, one of the senior volunteers shared stories about Grace's years of consistent service. He explained that she had quietly volunteered at the center every weekend since finishing college, often arriving before sunrise and remaining until every task had been completed. She had organized food drives during difficult seasons, helped elderly residents complete assistance applications, tutored children after school, and regularly visited neighbors who lived alone. Daniel listened carefully, realizing that everything Grace had accomplished had been done without publicity, awards, or recognition. No interviews had celebrated her efforts. No headlines had praised her generosity. Yet hundreds of ordinary lives had quietly become better because she had chosen to care. A feeling of deep humility settled over him. He remembered the first afternoon she had waved across the street and how easily he had dismissed her with barely a glance. The memory now carried quiet regret, not because she had expected anything from him, but because he had nearly overlooked someone whose character deserved the greatest respect. Before leaving the resource center, Daniel privately thanked Grace for inviting him. She smiled gently and replied, "Helping people becomes easier once we realize we all need each other sooner or later." As they walked back toward Willow Creek Lane beneath the warm afternoon sunshine, Daniel understood that the greatest lesson Grace had given him was not about volunteering or generosity alone. She had reminded him that the most meaningful lives are often built one unnoticed act of kindness at a time, long before anyone else realizes their true value. Several weeks later, the annual Neighborhood Appreciation Evening arrived, bringing together families, volunteers, teachers, firefighters, local business owners, and longtime residents beneath rows of warm string lights stretching across the community park. Children laughed while playing nearby, musicians performed familiar songs on a small wooden stage, and neighbors shared homemade meals as the sun slowly disappeared behind the maple trees. This year felt different from every celebration before it because Daniel Brooks had quietly requested to speak, not as a famous actor promoting a new project, but simply as another neighbor grateful to belong to the community. As the gathering settled into respectful silence, Daniel stepped toward the microphone without the polished confidence people usually associated with celebrity interviews. His expression reflected honesty rather than performance. He looked across the crowd until his eyes found Grace Carter standing near the back beside several volunteers arranging food donations for families who needed extra support. Taking a slow breath, Daniel smiled gently before speaking. When I first moved into this neighborhood, I believed success meant being recognized wherever I went. I thought people remembered the biggest accomplishments, the brightest lights, and the loudest applause. Then someone quietly showed me that the greatest influence often belongs to the person nobody notices. The crowd listened closely as Daniel continued. He admitted that when Grace first greeted him after moving into the neighborhood, he had barely acknowledged her because he had become so distracted by his own busy world that he stopped seeing the ordinary kindness surrounding him every day. He confessed that he had mistaken simplicity for insignificance, never realizing that the young woman living only a few houses away had quietly become the heart of the entire neighborhood through years of selfless service. The park became completely silent. Grace lowered her eyes modestly, clearly uncomfortable being placed at the center of attention. Daniel continued speaking with sincere gratitude rather than dramatic emotion. He described the countless small moments he had witnessed after that first meeting, the groceries she carried for elderly neighbors, the children she encouraged, the volunteers she inspired, the delivery driver she helped without hesitation, and the countless quiet acts that no camera had ever recorded. "She changed my life," Daniel said softly. "Not because she gave me advice. Not because she asked me to become different. She changed my life simply by living the values I had slowly forgotten." Many neighbors smiled knowingly because they had witnessed the same kindness for years. Daniel then stepped away from the microphone, walked directly toward Grace, and offered his hand with genuine respect. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly enough that only those nearest could hear. "Thank you for continuing to treat me with kindness even after I failed to return yours." Grace smiled with the same gentle warmth she had shown on the very first afternoon they met. "Everyone has busy seasons in life," she answered softly. "What matters is the choice we make once we finally notice each other." Her words immediately dissolved any remaining discomfort. The crowd responded with warm applause, not celebrating celebrity or public recognition, but honoring humility, forgiveness, and the quiet strength that had transformed an entire neighborhood. As the evening continued, Daniel chose not to stand apart as the center of attention. Instead, he joined Grace and the other volunteers distributing meals, arranging donation boxes, and cleaning the park after the celebration ended. Under the soft glow of the string lights, Willow Creek Lane quietly witnessed something far more meaningful than an apology. It witnessed the beginning of a genuine friendship built not upon fame or admiration, but upon mutual respect earned through simple kindness that expected nothing in return. Over the following months, the friendship between Grace Carter and Daniel Brooks quietly became one of the most meaningful stories on Willow Creek Lane, not because it attracted attention, but because it inspired others to care for one another in ways they never had before. Every Saturday morning, the two neighbors arrived together at the Community Resource Center, greeting volunteers, organizing donations, stocking shelves with groceries, arranging school supplies for children, and preparing care packages for senior citizens living alone. Daniel never announced his visits publicly. He asked that no photographers be invited and politely declined media interviews about the volunteer work because Grace had taught him that kindness loses none of its value simply because nobody is watching. The local families who visited the center appreciated him not as a celebrity, but as another familiar face willing to carry heavy boxes, sweep floors, and spend time listening to people who simply needed someone to hear their stories. Grace continued leading by quiet example, encouraging every volunteer with patience and genuine appreciation. Whenever someone thanked her for inspiring positive change, she gently redirected the credit toward the growing spirit of cooperation spreading throughout the neighborhood. Soon more residents joined the weekend projects. Teenagers began volunteering after school. Local businesses donated food and clothing. Retired teachers organized free tutoring sessions. Even children collected books and toys to share with families facing difficult seasons. Daniel watched the transformation with sincere amazement. He had spent years believing that influence came from millions of movie viewers, yet he now understood that lasting change often began with one thoughtful person choosing kindness in an ordinary moment. One afternoon, the elderly neighbor Grace had first helped after moving into Willow Creek Lane, invited everyone to a small garden gathering to celebrate the growing sense of community. Beneath blooming flowers and soft afternoon sunshine, neighbors shared homemade desserts while children played nearby. During the gathering, the elderly woman quietly raised a glass of lemonade and smiled warmly. Many people believe neighborhoods become stronger because beautiful houses are built, she said gently. I believe neighborhoods become stronger because beautiful hearts decide to stay. Everyone smiled as their eyes naturally turned toward Grace. She blushed slightly and laughed softly, clearly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. Daniel noticed her reaction and smiled because he finally understood something he had overlooked for far too long. True humility never asks to be recognized. It simply continues doing what is right. Before everyone returned home that evening, Daniel quietly thanked Grace once again for changing his perspective. Grace looked toward the peaceful street where neighbors stood talking together as children waved from bicycles and volunteers loaded the final donation boxes into a community van. People usually think one big moment changes a life, she answered gently. Sometimes it is only one small decision repeated every day. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, realizing those words described not only Grace's life, but also the quiet transformation of the entire neighborhood. As golden sunlight settled across Willow Creek Lane and warm laughter drifted through the evening air, it became impossible to remember a time when strangers had lived beside one another without truly seeing each other. One simple act of kindness had become another, then another, until compassion quietly replaced distance, respect replaced assumptions, and a famous neighbor finally discovered that the greatest legacy anyone could leave behind was not found on a movie screen, but in the ordinary lives made brighter by genuine kindness. Nearly 1 year passed, yet the quiet transformation that began with one overlooked greeting continued to shape every corner of Willow Creek Lane. New families moving into the neighborhood often commented on how unusually welcoming everyone seemed. They noticed neighbors helping one another carry groceries, children stopping to greet older residents by name, volunteers gathering every weekend at the community resource center, and strangers quickly becoming friends through simple conversations on front porches. Few newcomers understood where that spirit had begun, but longtime residents smiled whenever they remembered the ordinary young woman whose quiet example had reminded everyone what genuine kindness looked like. Grace Carter remained exactly the same person she had always been. Every morning, she watered the flowers surrounding her little white cottage, visited elderly neighbors who appreciated her company, and continued serving at the community center without ever seeking recognition. She politely declined every opportunity to receive awards, explaining that kindness became most meaningful when it remained part of everyday life rather than a special event. Daniel Brooks also remained successful in his career, but those closest to him noticed something even more important had changed. Whenever he returned home between film projects, he no longer disappeared behind security gates and busy schedules. Instead, he walked through the neighborhood greeting families by name, joined community cleanup projects, attended local charity events, and volunteered beside Grace whenever time allowed. The distance that fame had quietly created slowly disappeared because he had finally learned that being admired was never as meaningful as being present. One peaceful autumn evening, the neighborhood gathered beneath the maple trees for another annual celebration. Children laughed beneath glowing string lights, while homemade food covered long wooden tables and familiar music drifted softly through the cool evening air. During the gathering, one little boy asked his grandmother why everyone seemed to know one another so well. The elderly woman smiled gently before pointing toward Grace, who was quietly helping arrange donated books for local children, while Daniel carried folding tables beside several other volunteers. Because someone reminded us that every neighbor deserves to be seen, she answered softly. Daniel happened to hear those words as he paused beside the tables. He looked toward Grace with quiet gratitude, remembering the afternoon she had smiled and waved when she first moved into the neighborhood. It remained one of his greatest regrets that he had failed to return such a simple greeting, yet it had also become one of the greatest gifts life had ever given him because it led him toward a deeper understanding of humility, friendship, and genuine purpose. As the evening drew to a close, neighbors gathered together for one final photograph, not to celebrate a celebrity or honor a single individual, but to remember the community they had built together through countless ordinary acts of compassion. Warm lights reflected across smiling faces while children stood beside grandparents, volunteers beside teachers, and lifelong friends beside newcomers who already felt at home. Grace stood quietly among them, exactly where she always preferred to be, never in front of anyone else, simply another neighbor sharing the moment. Looking across the joyful gathering, Daniel realized that the smallest act had indeed changed their lives forever. It was never fame that united the neighborhood, nor wealth, nor recognition. It was one quiet heart willing to choose kindness first, and, because of that choice, every person on Willow Creek Lane learned that the greatest legacy anyone leaves behind is not measured by how many people know their name, but by how many lives become warmer because they chose to care.